Hello Year 6 and welcome to your first Flip Learning video. We're going to look this evening at coordination and subordination. First of all, we need to think about what is a clause. A clause is a group of words built around a verb. If the clause makes sense on its own, then we call it a main clause. Horses are beautiful is an example of a main clause because it makes sense on its own. It can be a sentence. It says there, a main clause can be a sentence, as you can see above. If the clause doesn't make sense on its own, then it's a subordinate clause. So an example of a subordinate clause might be when it rains. Because when it rains is a clause, but it is not a main clause. It cannot stand on its own as a sentence. Coordination. If you have two main clauses in a sentence, then they can be joined by coordinating conjunctions. You might have heard of possibly of conjunctions being called connections in the past, but we will now be calling them conjunctions. So just as I've said here underlined, you may know conjunctions as connectives. So an example might be, it was raining today and we had a lovely time splashing in the puddles. It was raining today is a main clause. It can stand on its own as a sentence. And we had a lovely time splashing in the puddles is a main clause. It can stand on its own. But we've joined them together with a coordinating conjunction and. It says both parts of the sentence are the main clause because they make sense in their own right. Examples of coordinating conjunctions are but, so, and or. And I've used the one and above, as you can see. So I'll just remind you again, if you've got two main clauses, and a main clause is a clause which can stand on its own and make sense as a sentence. If you have two of those main clauses, you can join them together with coordinating conjunctions and, but, so, or. Horses love to run free, so they run wild across the moors. You can see I've used the coordinating conjunction so there. The only reason you'll notice that after so I've put they run wild across the moors is because it wouldn't make sense to use horses again. So it's understood, it's implied that they refers to the horses. We call this ellipses. Subordination. A subordinate clause depends on the main clause to make sense, so it cannot stand alone and make sense as a sentence in its own right. That's what it says there. It cannot be a sentence and make sense without the main clause. Some conjunctions make one clause subordinate to the other. So we're looking back at conjunctions again. We're saying a subordinate clause depends on the main clause to make sense, and we can use conjunctions to show that one clause is subordinate to the other. Examples of subordinate conjunctions are when, because, if, and although. There are others, but they're good ones to start out with. So for instance, when it rains, cats prefer to stay indoors. Which part of that sentence do you think is the main clause, and which part do you think is the subordinate clause? So does when it rains, does that make sense as a sentence on its own? And cats prefer to stay indoors. Does that clause make sense as a sentence on its own? Hopefully you recognise that cats prefer to stay indoors is our main clause, and when it rains is our subordinate clause, and when is our subordinate conjunction. Dogs should be kept off the bed because they shed lots of fur. So because is being used here as our subordinate conjunction, And which part of the sentence do you think is the main clause? And which part of the sentence do you think is the subordinate clause? Dogs should be kept off the bed. Does that make sense on its own as a sentence? They shed lots of fur. Does that make sense on its own as a sentence? Hopefully you knew that the main clause in that sentence was dogs should be kept off the bed. If the weather is fine, I love to go sailing. So if the weather is fine, I love to go sailing. You can see we've used if again here as our, or if for the first time here actually, as our subordinate conjunction. Now, which part of the sentence do you think here is the main clause? If the weather is fine, or I love to go sailing? I think you should hopefully spot that I love to go sailing is the main clause. That makes sense on its own. And if the weather is fine is our subordinate clause because it only makes sense when it's joined to the main clause. Okay, that's the end of our flipped learning today. When you come back into class tomorrow, we're going to have a look at this, see if you can go through some examples, see if you can highlight some main clauses, some subordinate clauses, and use some coordinating and subordinating conjunctions. If you want to go back and watch that video again, please do, and I look forward to working on it in class tomorrow.